The flare was not the real problem. What came out of it was, when NASA's Parker solar probe sliced through a magnetic explosion near the sun, the particles did something that should have stayed comfortably inside a physics paper. The protons spread wide like a flashlight. The heavier ions shot forward in a tighter beam, more like a laser. One violent event. Two different behaviors. Two different shapes of danger. That alone would have been enough to make solar scientists pay attention. But by the time NASA revealed what Parker had seen, Artemis II had already carried 4 human beings beyond Earth's protective magnetic shield for the first time in more than half a century. That is what turns this from a science update into a survival story, because Parker did not simply discover that the sun is violent. Everyone already knows that in the lazy, decorative way people know many things about space. The sun flares, the sun erupts, the sun throws storms across the solar system. Fine. That version is simple, harmless almost. It makes the danger feel like background mythology. Parker ruined that comfort. It showed that one of the major processes behind solar storms may accelerate different particle populations in ways that are less tidy than the cleaner version of the story would prefer. Wide and narrow. Flashlight and laser. Not one neat stream of threat, but a split behavior inside the same explosive event. And the timing of that finding is what makes it hit so hard. Because Artemis II was not waiting for heliophysics to become emotionally convenient. Artemis II had already crossed the line. NASA described the mission as the first time in more than 50 years that humans ventured beyond Earth's protective magnetic field. During the flight, Orion acted as the crew's main protection against the sun's power, while NASA and NOAA watched solar conditions around the clock. The crew wore radiation trackers. The environment was not decorative anymore, it was operational. That is the hidden truth most people still do not say slowly enough. Artemis II was not only a mission around the moon, it was a mission beyond the system that has quietly protected every human body in history. And once you tell the story that way, a strange solar result stops feeling distant. It becomes personal. For years, the public version of deep space danger has been built around visible failure. We imagine a blown engine, a damaged heat shield, a missed burn, a crack, a leak, a fire. Something with shape, something loud, something the eye can understand instantly. That kind of danger fits storytelling well because it announces itself. It lets the audience point to the problem. But the deeper danger of Artemis-class exploration may not be the part with shape. It may be the invisible environment between Earth and wherever the crew is trying to go. And invisible danger is harder to love, harder to dramatize, and much harder to oversimplify once real human bodies are involved. That is why Parker matters. Its discovery does not become more important because it is dramatic. It becomes more important because humans are already back in the regime where that kind of complexity matters to actual missions. Before Artemis II, Parker's finding could still have been kept in a compartment marked solar physics. Important, yes. Elegant, yes. Worthy of papers, simulations, briefings, and model refinements. But it could still live at a comfortable distance from the public imagination. After Artemis II, that compartment breaks. Now the same finding belongs inside a human story. Because once a crew leaves Earth's magnetic protection, the sun stops being scenery and becomes part of the mission architecture. That is not poetic language, it is operational language. NASA said elevated radiation exposure can increase lifetime cancer risk and contribute to disorders that affect cognition and performance. That phrase matters more than it first sounds. Cognition and performance. Not only long-term health, not only an abstract future consequence quietly written into biology years later. Mission function, judgment, focus, clarity. The ability to remain useful while the environment stays indifferent. That is where this story hardens. Because the real danger was never only mechanical. It was environmental all along. Mechanical danger is easier for audiences because it looks like a scene. Environmental danger is worse in a more believable way. A mission can look orderly while the danger remains real. The crew can sound calm while the threat never becomes visible. The capsule can be functioning while the true antagonist stays outside the range of human intuition. That is what makes this such a strong documentary story. A successful mission can still reveal a frightening truth without ever becoming a near disaster. In fact, that is part of what makes it more unsettling. If Artemis II had almost been lost, the story would be easier. It would collapse into a single dramatic anecdote. But a mission that returns safely while still depending on active monitoring of an invisible hazard forces a much less comforting realization. It forces you to understand that success does not erase the environment. It only means the environment was managed well enough this time. That difference matters, and Parker makes it heavier, because Parker was not merely watching the sun from a polite distance. It crossed the right geometry to directly sample particles from a magnetic reconnection event in the solar wind. This was not a blurred remote impression. It was contact with the outflow itself. And what it found was the split. Flashlight and laser, protons widening, heavier ions staying tighter. A reminder that nature is under no obligation to package danger in the simple form our intuition prefers. That should trouble people more than it does, because simplicity is what human beings lean on when they want risk to feel manageable. We want one beam, one pattern, one threat description that fits comfortably inside a diagram. But Parker found divergence inside the same violent process. The event itself contained more complexity than the cleaner expectation wanted. And complexity is exactly what becomes expensive once humans are living inside the implications. That is the pivot this entire story depends on. Parker studied the mechanism. Artemis lived inside its consequences. Put those two missions together, and the tone of the new exploration era changes immediately. Suddenly, the moon is not just a destination. It is the object at the far end of a corridor we are not yet emotionally honest enough about. Because the real threshold of Artemis may not be the moon at all. It may be the point where Earth stops covering for us. That is the sentence hiding underneath the headlines. Earth has always been doing more than giving us air and gravity. It has been absorbing part of the cosmic hostility that would otherwise reach us more directly. Most people never feel grateful for that because they never had to live without it. Protection that is constant becomes invisible. The magnetosphere does its work so quietly that it disappears into the background of existence itself. Artemis II crossed out of that background, and once it did, Orion became the shield. That line should sound harder than it usually does. The spacecraft became the shield, not the planet, not the atmosphere, not the magnetic environment every human being has quietly lived inside for all of history. A machine, a capsule, a finite shell of engineered protection moving through a region where the body no longer has Earth covering for it in the same way. That is where the mission stops feeling nostalgic and starts feeling modern. Apollo is remembered in images. Artemis should be remembered, at least partly, in conditions. Conditions are harder to sell, but they are more honest. Exposure levels, solar monitoring, radiation trackers, thresholds, judgments, timing. The body's relationship to an environment it cannot negotiate with directly. That is the real grammar of deep space human flight, whether the audience enjoys hearing it or not. And Parker speaks that grammar with brutal clarity. Not because it found doom, not because it discovered some secret catastrophe NASA had ignored. Something colder than that. It discovered inconvenience. It reminded us that one of the sun's storm-driving mechanisms still refuses to behave in the cleanest possible way at exactly the moment human exploration is moving back into the exposed regime. That is a much stronger premise than generic fear. Because true unease does not come from shouting that something is terrifying. It comes from realizing the simple story was never simple enough. This is why the detail matters so much, flashlight and laser. The line is memorable because it gives shape to an invisible problem. We wanted one pattern. We got two. We wanted the particle story to stay tidy. It split. We wanted deep space danger to remain a manageable background concept. Parker reminded us that even the mechanism behind a major class of solar threat is still teaching us not to trust simplicity too quickly. And once humans are already beyond the shield, that lesson becomes expensive. Not emotionally expensive, operationally expensive. That is where the script should tighten again. Because some people will hear all of this and try to soften it with the safest possible interpretation. They will say, science is always refining. Of course, the models improve. Of course, one mission measures, another mission flies, and understanding gets better over time. All true. But that is not the deepest point. The deepest point is that human beings do not wait until the map is complete before they move. We move while learning. We learn while exposed. We refine while the mission is already underway. That is what makes exploration real and frightening. The old fantasy of exploration was that science would finish explaining the corridor first, and then people would travel down it with enough confidence to feel in control. Reality is messier. We send crews outward while knowledge is still sharpening critical details about the environment around them. We carry our best models with us, but we also carry the remaining imperfections inside those models. That is what Parker and Artemis say together. The next era of human exploration is beginning in a corridor where the body is vulnerable, the threat is invisible, and the understanding is better than before, but not clean enough to grant emotional comfort. That should change how people hear every future Artemis headline. Because from now on, moon mission should not sound like a simple destination story. It should also sound like a radiation story, a space weather story, a body inside an exposed system story, a story about the last quiet advantages Earth gave us before we ever knew to name them. And this is where the mission length matters. Artemis II was short. That fact should not reassure people too quickly. It should unsettle them in a more useful way. Only 10 days. Only 10 days beyond the shield. Only 10 days with Orion acting as the main protection. Only 10 days with agencies monitoring the sun continuously, while 4 people relied on a machine to do part of a planet's job. That phrase should stay with the viewer. A machine doing part of a planet's job, because it contains the whole emotional truth of the mission in one line. And once you feel that truth, the next question becomes unavoidable. What happens when the missions are longer? A short mission can survive on caution, timing, tightly managed margins, and a well-built vehicle. A longer future demands more. Better models, better warning, better shielding, better shelter logic, better honesty about what remains uncertain in the invisible corridor between Earth and everything beyond it. That is the real frontier now, not propulsion alone. Interpretation. Because the cruel thing about space weather risk is that it punishes overconfidence in understanding. That is why Parker's result matters so much. It is a strike against overconfidence. It says, this process was measurable, real, and still less tidy than you hoped. 1 event, 2 behaviors, flashlight and laser, a reminder that the sun is still capable of surprising the cleaner expectations we would rather trust. That should make the audience uneasy. And unease is good here. Inspiration is easy. Everyone expects inspiration from a moon mission. But unease means the story actually reached the buried layer. It means the viewer understood that the invisible threat is not just a science fact. It is part of the survival architecture of every mission that leaves Earth's magnetic protection. That is the verdict this script has been building toward. Not that the sun is suddenly worse. Not that Parker found doom. Not that Artemis II was secretly a disaster. Something colder. Something more useful. Artemis II did not just leave Earth. It left certainty first. That is the real line the mission crossed. Parker's particles only made that line harder to ignore. Because once the invisible danger shows behavior that resists our cleanest expectations, every future journey beyond Earth's shield has to be heard a little differently. The destination is no longer the whole story. The corridor matters. The environment matters. The body matters. The quality of our uncertainty matters. That is why this topic belongs in a premium documentary and not in a disposable news recap. It is not really about the flare. It is about what the flare revealed. The sun exploded. That should not have been the unsettling part. The unsettling part was that the explosion said something back, not in words, in particle behavior, in model correction, in the quiet reminder that the invisible enemy between Earth and the next era of exploration still does not agree to be simple. Artemis II came home safely. The crew survived. Orion held. But the most important legacy of the mission may be that it exposed how much of that success still depends on understanding a danger the sun itself just warned us not to oversimplify. We thought leaving Earth meant going farther. Parker and Artemis suggest something colder. It means leaving certainty first. That sentence should make future missions sound heavier the moment they are announced. Because the corridor between Earth and the moon is no longer just a path of distance. It is a path of environmental negotiation. Every hour beyond the shield becomes a negotiation with conditions the body cannot bargain with directly. Hardware, software, forecasting, and timing bargain on the body's behalf. The crew lives inside that bargain. The mission succeeds only if the bargain holds. And the truth matters now because the public is being asked to re-enter deep space history at exactly the point where the old mythology becomes too comforting. Apollo left behind unforgettable courage, unforgettable images, unforgettable scale. But it also left many people with an emotional memory of deep space flight that feels cleaner than the modern reality. Modern reality is fuller of monitoring, radiation accounting, model updates, and environmental interpretation. It is not less heroic, it is more honest. The finding does not tell us that our science is weak. It tells us our science is still alive. It is still being corrected by direct contact with reality. And direct contact matters because reality always has the final vote. A model can be elegant. A prediction can be confident. A diagram can feel complete. Then a spacecraft flies through the right place at the right moment and the universe replies with a split, flashlight, and laser. That is why the image matters so much to retention and to truth. It is not just memorable. It is diagnostic. It tells the viewer in one glance that the danger is not behaving as one simple stream of consequence. It is behaving in layers. Different particles, different patterns, one event. Complexity arriving inside the exact category of threat that human crews now have reason to care about again. And this is where the story becomes larger than Artemis II itself, because Artemis II is only the beginning of a new period of human movement beyond low Earth orbit. Short missions become rehearsals for longer ones. Controlled exposure becomes precedent. The argument that a crew can go out and come back becomes the emotional foundation for the next step, and then the step after that. That is why stories like this cannot remain soft. They are not just about one mission. They are about what assumptions will quietly travel into the missions that follow. If the assumption is that the invisible corridor is broadly understood, manageable, and emotionally secondary, then the public hears the wrong lesson. If the lesson is that the destination is the whole story, then the environment in between gets treated like scenery again. Parker pushes against that. It insists that the environment is still teaching. Artemis confirms that humans are already moving through it. Moon missions are no longer only quests of distance and symbolism. They are also tests of how well a civilization can read, respect, and survive an invisible system that was easy to ignore as long as everyone stayed home. Earth has always felt like normality. Parker and Artemis reveal that normality was partly a shield. Once that shield thins, the mission changes its meaning. Every checklist item, every dose reading, every quiet update from solar monitoring teams belongs to a deeper fact. Human bodies are again moving through a region where the sun is not merely light, but a variable in survival. That is why this script should end where it began, with the split. The particle split. That was the problem. Not because the event was spectacular, not because Artemis II failed, not because the sun suddenly became hostile in a new way. Because the split was a message from reality at the exact moment human exploration is returning to a place where reality does not need to simplify itself for our comfort. And that means the next era will not be defined only by how far we go. It will also be defined by how honestly we admit what we still do not fully control between here and there.